Some of you saw me go over to Tom a second ago. I'm going to stay here tonight. Some of you have had this surgery, so it's no big deal, but last Wednesday, I had one eye fixed. The other eye remains unfixed. And so right now, I'm Deacon Cyclops. Sometimes it's easier to move around like this, and sometimes it's necessary to do this. So we're kind of trying to make do. So in case you're looking up and see reflection from here, this eye and not this one. The other thing I have to tell you is, did you ever own a car like the boat that's described in the gospel? I had a car like that once. Anybody can walk faster than that car. That's kind of the boat that Jesus and the apostles got into. Last week, Father Roy mentioned a common frustration that those of us who preach and teach, especially about the scriptures, have. And tonight in the gospel, we see a great example of one of those frustrating phrases. And it comes at the very end of the gospel. And it says, and he taught them. But what did he say? It tells us all the other stuff that they did. And once he opens his mouth to teach, the gospel goes silent. But I think, as Father mentioned last week, what's important is not only what did Jesus say, but what did he do? And so that's where this whole imagery that we hear repeated throughout the liturgy tonight about the shepherd comes to play. Because indeed, that's what the message is, and I'm sure that's what Jesus was talking to these people about being God's sheep in God's sheepfold, with himself as the good shepherd. The first two readings we had, one we read and one we sang, come from two of the great prophets of Israel. Jeremiah, and then we did the responsorial psalm from Isaiah. Both of these prophets worked and ministered during the time of the great Babylonian captivity. The people had been hauled off into exile. Now Isaiah was with the people in exile. Jeremiah was with the folks that didn't get hauled off, and they were back in Jerusalem, feeling all kinds of survivor guilt and trying to figure out how they were supposed to keep going while the bulk of the population had been hauled away. And both these prophets are trying to speak to these people with comfort and with challenge to remain true to God and God's covenant with them. Now think about the language that Jeremiah uses. What does he cite as the big sin of those who were in charge, the shepherds of Israel? That they didn't keep the people safe. That they allowed the people to be scattered and separated and cut off from one another. That was the great sin, the great crime. How many times in our lives have we felt cut off and isolated and marginalized, maybe at school, maybe at work, or in our families? How many times, perhaps, have we been responsible for cutting those people off and keeping people at arm's length, putting them, in effect, in exile? The good shepherds that Jeremiah talks about are shepherds that are going to bring people together in unity, in communion, and not separate, and not divide. That's what we hear in the great psalm that we sang. We'll come back to that in a moment. But this theme that the shepherd is to bring people into unity. Seems like a strange message for us today, and I was pondering that this last week. You know, we read a lot today about our modes of communication. I guarantee you that before this Mass is over, somebody's going to be checking their email on their phone. We have smartphones, we have smart watches, we have computers, we have iPads, we have all kinds of things to keep us connected. And yet, what psychologists tell us is never have our generations been more disconnected. And I came across a term this past week that I'd never heard before, and it's called FOMO. Ever heard of FOMO? Psychologists refer to it now, and it stands for fear of missing out. I'm serious. This is not a joke. This is what for example, a lot of teenagers, they're so afraid that they'll be left out of some other activity if they don't get invited or don't get the right text at the right time. And there is a fear of missing out. So in this day when we are so technically connected, we can feel like exiled and isolated and marginalized. The second reading that we have tonight from St. Paul can begin to give us a sense of peace. Listen to the language that he uses when he talks to the Ephesians. He said, "For Christ is our peace." Christ. It's not that Christ brings peace. Christ is peace as the shepherd. He who made both, whatever is both, he made both one. He broke down dividing walls of hatred through his very flesh. He abolished the law with its commandments and legal claims that he might create in himself one new person in place of the two, and thus establishes peace in himself, and reconcile all with God in one body through the cross, putting hatred to death by it. And this last part of the reading, Christ came and preached peace to you who were far off, and peace to those who were near, those who were divided. Far off and near he preached peace. For through him, we both, near and far, have access to one Spirit, to the Father. As we consider our own sense of discipleship and how we are following Christ, the message could not be clearer. Our mission as disciples of Christ is to be assistant shepherds to Christ. It is to find wherever people are divided and to bring them together. Wherever there is isolation, to bring into community. And wherever there are people in fear and living in hatred, we bring love and compassion. I'd like to conclude by taking just another prayerful look at Psalm 23 that we sang as a responsorial psalm. Just consider some of these words in context. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. In verdant pastures he gives me repose, because all around me is drought. All around me nothing is living, but God brings me to life. Beside restful waters he leads me. He refreshes my soul, because there are times where I am depressed and angry and cut off. But the Lord refreshes me. He guides me in right paths, because I have a tendency to take the wrong one all the time. And even though I walk in a dark valley with death all around me, I fear no evil. Why? Because God is at my side. And you give me courage, God. God spreads the table before me in the sight of my foes. Even when I cannot provide for myself and my family, God will somehow miraculously provide. Even in the sight of those I consider enemies, God has no enemies. God has no foes. You anoint my head with oil, my